Chris Petit, an unjustly neglected filmmaker and writer, has for a quarter of a century cast an unflinching gaze across the physical and mental topography of England.
I think the big thing about kind of growing up in the 50s and even the 60s in England was how boring it was. The biggest moment in my life was when I got a driving license. I think driving rather than being driven is essentially a cinematic experience, and I think that the addition of the radio and the radio cassette, you can program this a soundtrack to your own life. I'd been reviewing films for about 4 or 5 years, and I was reaching a point where I was thinking, well, I don't actually want to be doing this for that much longer. I wasn't even that interested in transferring to what was then kind of Fleet Street. And so I was kind of looking for something to do, and I mean, the obvious thing was to try and come up with some sort of script or story for a film.
His film debut, Radio On, is one of the most uncompromising and personal films made by any British filmmaker. A monochrome, existential road movie whose hero sets out to solve the mysterious suicide of his brother in the West Country. As far as the film goes, the soundtrack is crucial. So how did you think about structuring the film according to the music?
Well, originally, it was there. I always saw, in a way, the film being propelled by the music, but the music used in a way that it wasn't normally used in film, which was as a kind of, as a kind of wallpaper or mood enhancer. And I was pretty sure from the beginning that it should kind of play in reality through some kind of speaker. So I thought you could structure the film around jukeboxes and radios and all the rest of it. I hadn't written a script before, so I was keen to eradicate as much as possible in terms of dialogue and exchange. So I kind of very crudely built it pretty much around the music. When the film became an Anglo-German co-production, I kind of thought, well, it makes sense to get Bowie, who was in his low period, and actually did Heroes in a half-English, half-German version. It seemed pretty obvious to use Kraftwerk in that they were, to my money, so cinematic. And then as far as this country is concerned, we had sort of stiff records, and I particularly wanted Reckless Eric's Whole Wide World. So we went to Stiff and we talked to people, and eventually we did a deal, and we sort of said, we can't afford to pay the going rate, and we offered them some sort of piddly sum of money to let us take yards and yards of their music. I mean, I knew the kind of ambient temperature in the film was pretty much sub-zero, and we weren't really going to get much above the permafrost. And we were also filming in what turned out to be the kind of coldest winter in sort of 20 years. The mood had already been set before we started filming.
It was released in 1979 to generally favourable reviews, but promptly forgotten. Despite an invigoratingly hip post-punk soundtrack and an outlaw attitude inspired by the new German cinema, the film never really found its audience. The conventional motives of narrative, suspense, psychology and resolution were bled from the film. It's an almost forensic record of an exhausted country searching for a new identity.
I suppose if you go back to the first shot of a man lying dead in the bath, and me being the person having that thought, I thought, well, where do you go with the story? Either you can go into a flashback as to what, which would be American film noir style, how this man got into that situation. But then I thought, well, given that I knew I wanted to make a film about a journey, it should actually involve somebody coming from another city.
Jasmine, I saw you breathing. As I push my foot down to the floor.
looking at the film again, there are about sort of two moments in which the film does lighten up, which I think, if I did it again, those are the moments I kind of hammered down very hard with a hammer. And I remember the time of doing the scene in Chippenham, that I think I felt sorry for David Beams by then. You know, we'd put him through 3 weeks in which we didn't let him say anything. We'd put him in a car with a kind of psychotic squatty where he didn't know what was going to happen.
Bastard! 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 Bastard!
And I think that with the scene in Chippenham, I just kind of stood back and I thought, well, you know, just go for it, you know, because we've given you such a hard time.
You're an Eddie fan, huh?
His work gives an open invitation to look again at man's seemingly barbaric impositions on the natural landscape. Buildings, roads and machines may be the true reflections of our own nature.
My father was in the army, so I'm an army brat, so we moved around a lot, both around England and abroad, so I was kind of, you know, whether I wanted to be or not, was habitually restless, so you kind of moved every couple of years. I came to London in the early 70s, and that coincided with time out when it was in a good period. It was pretty feisty in those days and pretty interesting in its kind of cataloguing of films. So I used to seek out these obscure cinemas showing obscure films and take obscure journeys. And then it was a step from that to really kind of on Sundays going out and kind of cataloguing various film locations, and the obvious one being Merrion Park, which is where Antonioni made Blow Up. So it became something to do, and then after doing this for a while, you kind of realised that you had a kind of map of the city which was different from the usual one. And then I started driving, and that became a completely different kind of map again.
As a youth, Petit explored the films that inspired him by revisiting their locations. He would retrace how the director had transformed these raw spaces into fiction